In 2002, while out quadding near an abandoned gravel pit, Derek had an absolutely horrifying face to face encounter with a canine variant 3 dogman. But before we get to his encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you've had an encounter with anything unexplained that you would like to have shared on the show, please email me at the link below. I would love to hear from you. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And the next time you're going out for a boot on your quad and you decide, you know what, I'm going to have a bonfire, before you light that match, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Today's encounter comes from Derek and it happened in 2002 while he was out quadding by the Lafarge Pits out in eastern Manitoba. The Lafarge Pits is located just east of the town of Richer, and what I find very interesting about this location is the fact that I've covered now 3 dogman encounters from eastern Manitoba. The very first one I did was Roberts in 1996 up by the town of Norris. The second one was Jason in 2003 while he was snowmobiling out by the town of Richer. And now Derek's up by the Lafarge Pits. What's very interesting about these 3 locations is the fact that they're located about 30 kilometers from each other. So it's really not that far apart. Now, the woods and the forest in between these locations is incredibly dense, full of swamps and lots of bogs. But it is also teeming with wildlife, everything from white-tailed deer, moose, a lot of small game. There's also a lot of creeks and rivers and a ton of beavers in this area. So there would be a very adequate food source for something like this in that area. Now, where Derek was quadding at the Lafarge Pits, it's a very popular recreation area in Manitoba. There's just down the road from the Lafarge Pits, there's several stock trout ponds called Reynolds Ponds. Now, to get to this location, you have to go down Highway 1 east of Winnipeg, past Richer, until you get to Path 13. From there, you turn north off the highway, and it's about a 10-kilometer drive down this really poor gravel road. It's kind of more like a glorified logging road. There used to be a lot of logging operations in the area, as well as a lot of gravel quarry operations as well. Now, this road can get washed out very easily. Every spring, this road does wash out. Some years, you might only have a couple of inches of water across a couple spots. Other years, it could completely wash the road out. In 2002, when Derek was going out quadding, him and his buddies started driving down that road, and they actually got to a part of the road that was just completely washed out. So they were forced to back their trucks down this road almost all the way back to the highway. Once they were towards the highway, there's a big power line just before the highway. It's about 100 yards off. They backed their trucks onto this power line, unloaded their quads, jumped on them, and then they continued the rest of the way on their quads themselves. So Derek and his buddies made their way down that winding road till they got to a hard right. At that hard right, there's these 2 huge cement pillars, one on the left and one on the right, and that's the entrance to the Lafarge Pits. However, back in the early 2000s, in between those 2 pillars was this massive pile of gravel, and Derek and his buddies did not want to risk tipping one of the quads trying to get over this pile. So they took a right at that hard right, continued down the road for about another kilometer to where the road comes to a T. Once they got to the T, they turned left and they headed north towards Reynolds Ponds. After driving for about a kilometer and a half down that road, the bush line on the left-hand side kind of opens up and there's a bit of a clearing. So once they got to that clearing, they turned off the gravel road and then they made their way to the pits through this very overgrown trail that runs for about 2 kilometers. It kind of zigzags through the bush. Once they exited that trail, they were immediately greeted with the sight of the Devil's Punch Bowl. The Devil's Punch Bowl, as a lot of quadders and dirt bikers call it at the Lafarge Pits, is this big pit in the ground. It's completely full of sand. It does get water in it from time to time, and it gets incredibly muddy. And a lot of people that go quadding and dirt biking out there like to spend a lot of time going down into this pit and then coming back up out the other side. And that's exactly what Derek and his buddies did for about the first hour. They spent an hour just going down into this pit and back up the other side. After spending an hour doing that, they decided they were going to make their way towards the 2 lakes. Now, there's 2 lakes at the Lafarge Pits. They're often called the Small Lake and the Big Lake. The small lake is kind of located a little bit more to the west, and the big lake's kind of located right in the middle of the property as well. These lakes are not your typical lakes. They're actually old gravel quarries where they've struck a spring at the bottom and they've filled up with water. They have probably the most clear water anywhere in southern Manitoba. They are absolutely beautiful. So once Derek and his buddies were finished over at the Devil's Punch Bowl, they headed north towards the small lake. On the south shore of the small lake, there's this massive pile of sand and gravel that over the years has become rock hard. It's about 60 feet tall by about 150 yards wide. So once they got to this hill, they made their way up the hill with their quads. Once they got to the top, they kind of stopped and they were just kind of taking in the scenery around them. The entire time while they were at the top of this hill, they really had to pay attention to how far they got towards the edge of the north side of this hill, because at the north side, it's almost a vertical drop about 60 feet down into the water. And where the water is at that point is about 70 feet deep. So they did not want to accidentally get too close, have it crumble, and drop into the water. So after spending about 15 minutes at the top of the hill, just kind of talking and looking around, they decided that they were going to head towards the old ruins of the quarry, which is just south of that small lake. So they made their way down this hill and over to the old quarry site. Once they were there, they spent about 45 minutes to an hour just kind of exploring all the old abandoned buildings and all the old abandoned equipment. And then they started to talk about what they were going to do next, because it was going to be getting dark soon. And they decided, you know what, let's go have a bonfire on the east side of the large lake. So they all hopped on their quads and they started making their way towards the south shore of the large lake, which really from where they were was only about 300 yards. Once they got to the south shore, they came upon this little dirt trail that ran east and goes up this hill, and it's incredibly sandy. It goes up about 60 to 70 feet. So when they got to the base of the hill, they drove up to the top, and at the top it really starts to level out, and it's a big clearing that runs for about 200 yards side to side, and then depth wise is about 150, and it's surrounded by just absolutely dense bush. So once they got to the top of this hill, they found a nice spot where they'd be able to make a bonfire. They turned their quads off, and then they kind of went and gathered up some firewood. They ended up making a fire. They sat around it for quite a while, just talking and enjoying each other's company. After a couple of hours, it was full on dark at this point. They went to hop onto their quads, and Derek noticed that his front passenger side tire was incredibly low. It was almost right flat. At this point, he had one of two choices. He can either hop on one of his buddy's quads and go all the way back to his truck where he had a spare tire, or he could hang out with his quad and wait for his buddies to go get the tire and bring it back to him. Derek was not too fond of the idea of leaving his quad unattended. Back in the early 2000s, there were not a lot of people that went to the Lafarge pits. The people that would go there would typically be quadders or dirt bikers, the very odd angler. But Derek just did not want to risk leaving his quad there, coming back, and it being gone or having it be vandalized. So he said to his buddies, you know what, I'm going to wait with my quad. I have a spare tire in my truck. So he gave his buddy a key and said, you guys go get my tire, bring it back, and then we'll get going. So his buddy said, all right. They took his key and they drove off into the darkness. So he watched his buddy's taillights disappear towards the Devil's Punch Bowl. Once they got to the bowl they had turned, he could no longer see them. And he knew that now he was 100% alone. And it made him a little bit nervous. So he just kind of sat with his back up against his quad, looking towards the fire. And a few minutes later, he heard a howl off in the distance that really shook him. He said that he's heard wolves howl before and coyotes howl, but this howl was different. It was incredibly guttural and very low, and it really put him on edge. So he really started paying attention to everything going on around him at this point, and he noticed that all those sounds he had heard before were completely gone. The area was just dead silent, and that really put him on edge even more than he already was. So he was sitting there just kind of listening at this point, and about a couple minutes later, he could hear something moving on the other side of the fire. So he kind of turned and leaned a little bit so he could try to look around the flames. but he couldn't see anything. But he could hear something very heavy moving just out of view. So at this point, he decided to stand up and he started kind of making his way around the side of the fire, trying to see if he could see what this thing was. As he made his way around the right side of the fire, all of a sudden he saw this massive silhouette of something huge move behind the flames. So he stepped a couple more steps, and he said that all of a sudden, right in front of him, no more than 20 feet away, was this massive dogman creature looking directly at him. And when he first saw it, his first thought was werewolf. He describes this dogman as being about 8.5 to 9 feet tall, incredibly muscular upper body. He only got a look at the one arm, but he said the arm was fairly long, and he said it had noticeable claws off the end of the fingers. He said the lower legs were muscular as well, but they bent backwards just like a dog's. He could not see if this thing had a tail from the angle that he was looking because part of its body was obscured by the flames. So he's looking directly at this dogman, and this thing's just staring right back at him. He froze in fear at this point. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he should run, if he should scream. So he just stared right back at this dogman. And this dogman all of a sudden pulled its lips back, showed its teeth at him, and let out this really guttural growl. At that point, Derek freaked out, ran towards his quad. He fired it up. He did not care at this point about blowing a tire or damaging a rim. He just wanted to get as far away from this dogman as he could. So once his quad was fired up, he floored it and made his way back down that hill. And instead of turning and going towards the Devil's Punch Bowl, which is the way that he had come into the pits and the way that his buddies had left, he continued heading west towards those two giant concrete pillars. Once he got to those pillars with the big gravel pile in the middle, he floored his quad, jumped over that pile of gravel, landed on the road, and as soon as he hit the road, he heard his tire blow out and he felt his quad start to veer off to the side. He managed to regain control and he made it about a half a kilometer down the road before he lost control and ended up crashing into the trees on the side of the road. At that point, he ended up knocking himself out. He said he could not really account for the next few minutes. He said when he kind of managed to pull himself up off the road, he started looking around and he said he could hear what sounded just like the footsteps that he heard from this dogman walking on the other side of the fire, moving through the trees towards him on the side of the road. At that point, he just pretty much, he said he gave up. He just sat down, put his back up against the quad, and he closed his eyes. He figured that any second now he was going to be ripped apart by this thing. However, he said that those footsteps all of a sudden stopped. And about 15 minutes later, he could see his buddies coming down the road. When they found him, he was pretty banged up because when he wanted to get away from that dogman, the last thing on his mind was putting on his helmet. So when they found him, he was bleeding from his head, he was bleeding from his arms. And they asked him, like, dude, what the hell happened? And he told them that he had crashed his quad running away from a werewolf. And his buddies did not believe him. They blamed that entire situation on him knocking himself out. They figured when he crashed his quad, knocked himself out, he basically just dreamed that entire thing. So Derek was trying to convince them as they were helping him up that no, this happened before I crashed my quad, but they were still not buying it. As they kind of got him up to his feet, they were kind of looking at him, making sure he was okay. All four of them heard that same howl that Derek had heard up on the hill. And as soon as they heard that, Derek said, "We need to go." And he just jumped onto the back of one of his buddies' quads. And his buddies, even though they had not seen this thing, just hearing that howl put them into flight mode. So they jumped onto their quads and they floored it down the road back towards their trucks. They ended up going back the next day with one of their buddies' trucks that was a lot bigger to go get Derek's quad. Now, Derek's advice is if you ever come across or have an encounter with a dogman or any form of a cryptid or anything really not recognized by mainstream science, he said, expect to be ridiculed. He said, but just be true to yourself. If you've had an experience like this, you know that this has happened. And he said, at the end of the day, that's really all that matters. Well, that's it for today's encounter. I just want to add that the Lafarge pits today are a lot different than they were in the early 2000s. Those big sand hills along those two lakes are no longer there. The Lafarge Corporation has actually knocked those down into the water, and they've removed that gravel pile from between those two pillars. And today it's a very popular area for camping and for swimming as well as for fishing in those two lakes. Now, I'm also going to put in the description below links to the other two Dogman videos from Manitoba. Just in case you're interested in watching those, I do recommend checking them out. And as always with this video, if you have any comments, please leave it in the comments below. I do make an effort to reply to every single comment here on the channel. And if you haven't done so already, next time you go out for a boot on your quad and you decide, you know what, I'm going to have a bonfire, before you strike that match, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.